Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com.
Hey now, today we're going to take a look at Guesstimaster from Acabo Games. This is, well, it's not really a party game because it only goes to 4 players, but I guess you could play it with more. But it has a party game feel to it. It's very light, and as the name implies, it's all about guessing based on trivia questions that are sometimes very strange, but also sometimes just very, very specific on very broad categories. So for instance, how many babies were born in Sweden on the date when the birth rate was at its lowest in 2007? How many in vitro fertilized babies have been born in the world until today? I guess these were very baby-centric questions. How many lawyers are there in China? So obviously, unless you've got like Rain Man style talents, you are not going to know the exact answers to these questions. But it's not about that. It's about trying to get as close as possible to what the correct answer is, and maybe trying to fool the other players into thinking you know what the right answer is. So let me go ahead and give you a brief look at how the game is played, then we're going to come back and I'll let you know what I think. In Guesstimaster, your goal is to be the first person to get to 7 points on the point track. Every player is going to take a cube of their color that they'll put on the scoring track, and then a cube of their color that they're going to put in front of them. This is what you're going to use to indicate your guesses on the board. Now, one thing I'd like to point out is that the game comes with pads and pencils, and I have no idea why. But I forgot to mention this in my final thoughts. I just thought I'd mention it here. So you have these things. Okay, I guess you'll use them if you want to keep notes or keep track of important and significant statistics you hear during the course of the game. Also, the game comes with an hourglass, which you do use during the game, although the rules make it a bit unclear whether or not everyone is supposed to have that amount of time for the round, which doesn't make sense. The way we played it is that everyone just guesses at the same time, but I suppose if you wanted to take more time, you could just flip the hourglass for every person's turn, but that's going to take a while. In any event, you're going to decide who's going to go first. You're going to roll the action die. Each of the symbols on this die corresponds to a different category on the question card. So whoever's turn it is going to roll the die. They're going to pick up a card, and they're going to read the question on the card. And you're going to go in turn order. The person who had to read the question makes their guess first. Just to give you an example of what some of the cards are, let me grab them from the center, because I think I read some of those in my final thoughts. You have cards like, let me focus a bit. How big is the global market for saffron? How many seabirds died in Alaska during the catastrophic Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1979? How many people speak Russian as their first or second language? I'll see how there's different types of categories. And here, I'll give you another example. How many mobile phone subscriptions were there in the world in 2009? How many abandoned oil and gas wells are there in the Gulf of Mexico? How many native Spanish speakers are there in the USA? So let's say we went with the cell phone one. How many mobile phone subscriptions were there in the world in 2009? So that's our question. And so at that point, what we're going to do, again, starting with the person who actually read the question, you're going to take your guessing cube and you're going to indicate out on the board what you think your guess is, and you also have to say it as well. So I might say, okay, I think there were 100 million people. That's probably way too low, by the way, but I'm just going to say 100 million people had mobile phone subscriptions in 2009, and someone else might say, well, no way, I'm going to say it was 200 million people, and then the third person might say, well, I think it was less than that. I think it was probably just 1,600,000 people, and so on. So everyone has a guess. You can't guess the exact same thing as someone else did. Then you're going to look at the other side of the card and see what the correct answer was. So over here, it was, oh yeah, so we were like completely off and we're all ridiculous. 4.6 billion people. Now, down here at the bottom of this, so stop laughing at us, me and my fictional cohorts here. Over here we have, you see there's little indicators here. These are orders of magnitude greater than or less than what was actually chosen. So this one says between 400 billion and 46 billion is +1, and +1 is 3.5 billion to 5.8 billion. What that means is that this has to do with the scoring and the amount of points that you're actually going to score for this. So everyone who is within the long interval, which in this case was 400 million to 40 billion or 46 billion, is going to get a point, and you'll move yourselves up. So in this case, None of us were. But let's make believe that we were. Let's say that both orange and red were within the long interval. You also get points if you're within an extra point if you're within the short interval, which is in this case it was going to be between 3.5 billion to 5.8 billion. So you were relatively close to what the actual number was. In this case, in our fictitious case, ignore what's actually on the board, we would go ahead and say that orange and red got to move up another point. And then lastly, whoever was the absolute closest to the right answer, we'll go ahead and say red, gets another point. But remember that even though that seems like, wow, you've just gone really up high, most times in an actual example, you're going to be way off, and it's going to be very rare that you can get a point, although the game is not too long. But in any event, once that is done, you're going to get rid of that card and go on to the next question card. There is actually one more thing, though. Whoever is the absolute farthest away from the real answer, whether they get a point or not, whoever was the farthest out is going to get an action card. The action cards are just little helper aids that help you get one up on your opponents in future rounds. It's sort of a catch-up mechanism. So I'll just show you a few of these here. And by the way, I don't actually like these. I'll talk about them in my final thoughts. Hubris, used on any player who must then be the closest to the correct answer. Otherwise, he or she will not get any points. Just show you some other ones. You have Swap. Swap your guessing marker with another player's guessing marker before the correct answer is read. Last Man Standing allows you to be the last to make a guess and place the guessing marker on the board. There's another Hubris. Too High. If other players, not you, have guessed higher than the correct answer, their guesses will be disregarded. So they're just a way for you to kind of screw over the other players and to help give yourself a leg up. But that's pretty much the game. You're just trying to make your absolute best guess based off of really crazy questions that no one could possibly know the exact answer to. But all you want to do is get close to the right answer and hopefully be the first person to get to 7 points. That is Guesstimaster. Let's get to my final thoughts. Well, that's Guesstimaster, and I often start off my reviews in the final thoughts segment by talking about theme and components, which really isn't much to speak of here. This is mainly in the trivia category of games, and the components are fine for what they are. The board's a little bit weird by kind of necessity, but I dig it. It's okay. I like the big chunky cubes that you use for your player markers. But moving on from that, the gameplay. This is a very hard game. Maybe in the spirit of the game, it's a hard game for me to peg down. It is a trivia game, but it's a trivia game where you're not expected to know the right answer. You just have to be in the ballpark and try to be as close as possible and maybe kind of bluff out the other players and make them think that you know the right answer or that you don't know the right answer and keep them away from you and try to score as many points as you can on your own. That's really as complicated as it gets. It's not a very complicated game, and in fact, there are action cards in the game that make the game a little more complicated. I could totally do without those, and you could play without them as a matter of fact. This game can be a lot of fun if you have the right mindset for it, because some of the questions are just, I don't want to say ridiculous, they're perfectly valid questions, but there's no way you'll ever know them. None. And it can be very, very amusing. So for instance, some of them are based on things you'll just never know. Like, how many Eiffel Towers could be erected with the world's total production of steel in 2009? How would I know that? What's the world's total production of steel in 2009? It's probably less than what it was, but you're just guessing. I mean, and sometimes the answers are shocking, so big that it's hilarious. Here, I'll just tell you, spoiler alert. It's, how many would you think? Number of Eiffel Towers based on steel production. Well, the real answer is 103,000. That's a lot. I would have said less, okay? So just that kind of stuff can be amusing. Some of them you might think like, well, okay, I can think about this for a little bit and probably come up with a pretty good answer. So for instance, how many times does the human heart beat on average per day? Well, if you really think about that hard enough, you might be able to come up with an answer. But how many would you say? I'm thinking about it now, and I would say probably, it's got to be hundreds of thousands, right? And the correct answer is 800,000. I actually think that's low. So, and some of them can get really silly, like how many pine needles are on an evergreen tree. So it can be very funny to hear the responses and to have people guessing wildly different numbers and to think, oh, I got this, I know this, and be like way, way off. The game is not to be taken seriously, and if you're in that frame of mind, I thought it was a lot of fun. I think that my biggest complaint about it, aside from the dumb action cards, is that it only goes to 4 players. I think that you could easily do this with way more players, and it would be even more fun, kind of a wits and wagers type thing, if the components allowed for that, and if there was... there is a decent amount of trivia cards in the box, but it needs even more for even more longevity, which would be my only complaints about the game. But otherwise, I think I'm holding on to it. I think it's pretty darn interesting, much more so than I would expect from any trivia game, which is a genre I had pretty much given up on. So that's Guesstimaster. Try it out. You might be surprised. We had a lot of fun with it.
Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.